of Michael Korie, who's written lyrics to some monumental pieces, particularly Grey Gardens. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Bruce.
Tell me about Teaneck, New Jersey. Were you near the Armory? I had in-laws that had a house a block from the Armory.
Not too far from the Armory. The Armory was near my 6th grade school, Bryant School. And I grew up in Teaneck from about the 3rd grade till the end of high school. My mom is still there. Just managed to get her into Holy Name Hospital to get her COVID vaccine.
It is. I did mine. Yeah. So someday you'll have one too. So, did you write at all in early years?
Well, I wrote a song about gerbils. For some
grade school, I hope, and not high school.
Yes, it was grade school, and then there was a very, very long interim till I wrote a song again.
Did you write the music also for gerbils?
It was a song about gerbils in love. That was the first song I ever wrote, and it was for some creative writing assignment in junior high, something like that. And it really never occurred to me to write songs, particularly theater songs, though I loved theater, I loved musicals. It just never occurred to me that I could do it. I had grown up with a sort of legend that Cy Coleman was distantly related to me. And
someday you and Cy would
yes.
write Sweet Charity, or?
Yeah, and I love those shows, and I just love the idea that I was distantly related. Let's see, my grandmother's sister, it was my grandmother's sister's nephew, something like that.
Yeah.
So figure out the 9th cousin or something, but it felt thrilling to have some kind of relation, but it never occurred to me that I would do it myself. I was a pianist, and I also learned how to play the pipe organ and the harpsichord.
So you envisioned that as a potential career?
Pardon me?
Did you envision that as a potential career early on?
Not really. I thought that my fingers were too wide for the smaller keys of a harpsichord.
Would it be longer too? Did you ideally have long fingers?
Well, they were okay lengthwise, but they were too wide for the harpsichord. And the organ had, 32 foot pedals, which was just, it was mind-boggling to be playing on 2 keyboards and with feet at once. I got up to like the Bach's little toccata and fugue, and that was about my high point. But
what musicals can you recall going to see at the early age?
Oh, well, my parents used to take me to the Equity Library Theater on
103rd and Riverside.
Yes, and I think that in the intermission they would do a pitch and pass the basket, and it was something that a family could afford to go to. And I saw tons of musicals that you would never have expected to see, things like Panama Hattie or Ernest in Love, and I just Ben Bagley's reviews and every kind of crazy thing they did. I think they did the first revival of Follies with costumes made by the women inmates at the penitentiary in Greenwich Village, which Clive Barnes gave a bad review to. But anyway, I grew up loving these musicals. The first Broadway musical I saw was Hello, Dolly with Carol Channing.
The first time around?
That was the first Broadway musical I saw, yeah. And we sat in the very last row of the second balcony of the St. James, and I waved, and I was convinced she was waving back at me. And the first opera I saw was Carmen with Regina Resnick at the Met. Regina Resnick was a great singer, but she was no Carmen at that age. Mm-hmm. And I went to see all the Sondheim musicals. I would take the bus in with my friend from Teaneck, starting in like the 9th or 10th grade, we would go in by ourselves. We would go
On a Saturday afternoon?
Saturday afternoons. We would go see, You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown in the East Village, or Coco. We saw all the Sondheim musicals when they were brand new. And Pearly, all kinds of things. You could get a seat for $3 then in the last row and then move down.
So at what point does a professional endeavor happen?
Well, during college, I was studying psychology, which I found to be dull, and was accompanying the Gilbert and Sullivan groups for their spring musicals and their radio shows in both Brandeis University and Boston University, the Boston University Savoyards. And then I had it with Boston, and I decided I wanted to be a journalist. I came to New York City in my junior year and enrolled in one of the only undergraduate journalism programs at that time. This was right before All the President's Men, when it suddenly became in vogue to be a journalist. And I found myself a job opening the mail at the Village Voice. And then
you had to do, were there not other things to do?
Well,
more exciting?
It progressed from opening the mail to
writing.
I was like 18, and they were letting me edit dance reviews, and then it grew to writing short reviews for the theater section, and I started covering news, gay rights, and I was, a kid. And then a call came in from another newspaper for an arts editor. I recommended myself. And by like 20, I was 21, I became the editor-in-chief of that paper. It was called Wisdom's Child New York Guide. It was West Side, East Side, and Village. We came out every week. We covered local arts and news. It was, freebies that they gave out in lobbies of buildings. But I got a lot of great writers to write for me, like including Terrence McNally wrote a theater column, and Roger Greenspun. And I thought I was, hotshot at age 21. And then by 25, I was burnt out and decided for some reason that I wanted to write music. And by that time, I had met my spouse, who's now my spouse. We've been together 40 years. And he had been managing dance companies. He came from Wheaton College, where he was in the French department and managed the modern dance program. And he came to New York to be a dance manager. And I said, well, I've been supporting you while you've been on unemployment or employed. That's how they worked in those days. The early days of dance management, they would fire each other, go pick up their check at unemployment, and then come back to work. So I said, I've been subsidizing you. Now you subsidize me for a few years while I try to break into musical theater. And miraculously, I did. I got into Lehman Engel's musical theater workshop at BMI.
Who was there at that time?
Well, who was there was Alan Menken and Howard Ashman. Maury Yeston would wander in from time to time. A lot of people who went on to writing screenplays and television and things like that. Lynn Ahrens and Steve Flaherty. And we all became friends. And I remember one of the days, Lehman was a great guy, but he was ailing. He had gout and various other problems, and he would sort of prop his leg up on a chair and say, okay, what have you got for me this week? Howard Ashman and Alan Menken came in one week and said, we have something new. And they played this song about a singing plant. singing "Feed Me Seymour, Feed Me All Night Long." And the class just broke up. They thought it was fantastic. But Layman had no idea what this was. A singing plant? The man sure tastes like plant food to me. He said, well, if you like it, to all of us. And then 9 came out. And so that was the era. And
But were you writing by yourself or you were teamed?
I was writing by myself at that time. I was writing music and lyrics. But my first opportunity actually came to work with another composer, Skip Kennett. And we did a show for Cleveland based on a Shaw play. And then I got interested in working with the composer Stuart Wallace. And we started writing this crazy piece combining comic strips like Dick Tracy and political events like current events of all the villains of the world and new vaudeville. And we wrote this crazy piece called Where's Dick that Playwrights Horizons did 2 workshops of. And then somebody said, well, this is all sung. This is an opera. And I said, okay, fine. I'm an opera librettist. I had no intention to be one, but and then the Houston Grand Opera did it with direction by Richard Foreman, and suddenly I was in opera. And what I learned was that though I had wanted to write musicals, musicals couldn't support me. They don't pay. You work in privacy alone. You get no money. You get no advances. You get no grants. And if you're lucky enough to get through the workshops and readings, eventually you might get paid if it ever gets to public performance. But opera, they have to cast years in advance, and they have to plan their productions years in advance to sell their subscription series. So they give you a commission and you can get grants. So I found that I could survive by writing operas and living off the grant that I had from the one before while I write the next one, or the commissions. And well, you know, the first opera was Where's Dick? It was very topical. Everyone in it was a villain, including a character named Stump Tower, who was based on Donald Trump, of course. I had my eye on him for a long time. I knew he was a crook even back then.
We should have listened to you. We should have listened to you.
They should have listened to me, but he was I made him the midget master builder, and he was building the world's tallest hole in the ground. And I knew from New York newspapers when I was a kid what a con man he was. And so I made him the villain of my opera. And then that led to other operas. We got another commission from Houston Grand Opera to do Harvey Milk, which at that time was the first major openly gay opera. And that made a big splash. It got done around in San Francisco. It got recorded. It got done in New York. Got done in concert. And actually, all these years later, it's coming back next year. As soon as we can go back into theaters. It's coming back in a new production in St. Louis and one in San Francisco. I wrote other avant-garde operas with Stuart Wallace, Kabbalah for BAM, Hopper's Wife. But I always wanted to get back to musicals. And then I met Scott Frankel. There was a conductor named Michael Barrett, who was a disciple of Leonard Bernstein. And he was running the New York Festival of Song. And he was asked by Philadelphia, the American Musical Theater, Marjorie Samoff and Eric Saltzman, to put together a review of new musical theater people. We all had to write a song for this review. And Scott Frankel and I were paired up. And we enjoyed working together. We wrote a couple of musicals that didn't go anywhere. And then
tell us what those were. One
was about the 1939 World's Fair called Meet Mr. Future. I kind of took a Meet John Doe uh, type story and put it in the 1939 World's Fair. The other one was about Alma Mahler and Oskar Kokoschka, the artist, and their torturous love affair, which resulted in them breaking up. And he was so distraught and obsessed that he built a life-size human doll in her image and carted it around Vienna and made a scandal. And those got a lot of workshops and a lot of but nobody produced them. And we were both getting frustrated, and I was surviving on writing operas. And one day he was walking down the street, and the proverbial light bulb lit up over his head, and he called me up and said, "What would you think of doing a musical of Grey Gardens?" And it had not been released on DVD yet. It was still, on a videotape. And it had made a splash when it was new, but it had kind of become a cult thing and not widely known. But I had seen it, and I had learned by then any crazy idea was probably worth considering. So though it was a documentary, I don't think there had been any documentary musicals before then. And it was based on real people and this strange subject of Big Edie and Little Edie Beale living in a dilapidated mansion in East Hampton with 55 cats. I said, let me watch it again, and I'll tell you what I think. And I watched the documentary on videotape, and it went along till this part where Big Edie, the mother, is cooking ears of corn in a crock pot next to her bed for the handyman kid that was coming to help them out, Jerry. And she told her daughter, "Jerry loves the way I do my corn." And it was really, she was really giving a dig to her daughter, saying, "See what a good mom I am. I cook corn and this nice young man eats it, and you're a terrible daughter and you never cook for me." So there were all these levels in this song about corn. And I said, I have to write this show. This is, I have to do it because of this song. And we had no idea how to do it yet. But we negotiated the rights with Albert Maysles. That was a protracted thing because there are 5 filmmakers and all of that, but he was encouraging. And then we went to Doug Wright, the playwright, who had not yet written I Am My Own Wife, but he had been a classmate of Scott's at Yale, and they had done shows together. I think he had written one musical then with Michael John LaCusa about an axe murderer. But we went to him and said, "What do you think about Grey Gardens?" And he said, "Oh, I love Grey Gardens, the documentary. It's sacred to me. I could never make that into a musical. It's perfect the way it is." So we went away very dejected and said, how are we going to get Doug to write this? We by that time had an agreement with Maysles, but when you option a property, you have a limited time to get it up on its feet. You have 1 year to get it written and another year to get a visible major production, or you lose the rights and all the work. That's another problem with writing.
You have to pay something for this?
You have to pay something, right? And I had no money, but between the option payments and the legal fees to do this, and Albert Maysles, bless his heart, made us pay his legal fees too. We racked up, I'm telling you too much, but we racked up $100,000 to get the rights to this, neither of which we had. But we were proceeding on blind faith because we so loved this idea. But we didn't have a book writer. And we went out one day to a restaurant for lunch, said, how are we going to get Doug Wright to write this book? And it was one of these restaurants where they had paper tablecloths and a glass of crayons for bored children to doodle. Scott started doodling, and he drew 2 squares. And he said, look at this. I looked at it, and then he wrote the years 1940 something in the first square and 1970 something in the second square. And in the middle was just blank space. I said, oh, I get it. Each act would be a different era of Grey Gardens in its heyday, Grey Gardens in its dilapidated state, and the intermission would be, how did that happen? And we could balance each act off the other, and the first act could be like the Philadelphia story. It could be like a Philip Barry play when Grey Gardens is in its prime. And so we ripped this tablecloth off the table, held it up in front of Doug Wright, and said, what do you think? He said, I'll do it. Because he now had the opportunity to put his own original spin on the whole thing. He realized he could create Act 1 and then balance Act 2 off Act 1, and we wouldn't have to duplicate the documentary. We could do something new specifically for the stage. We didn't know how we were going to do it, but Albert Maysles approved of the idea, and somebody asked, what are you doing? And I said, well, we're beginning to work on this thing. And we went away for a weekend to Cape Cod, and we came up with the idea that the mother, Big Edie, likes to perform concerts. And she's basically an amateur ham. Likes to inflict her performances on everyone who will listen. And so we said, what if she wanted to do a concert at her daughter's engagement party? And as a matter of fact, we had found out by this time that little Edie had been dating Joseph Kennedy Jr., the elder brother of John F. Kennedy, who died in World War II. So suddenly a story came together that the first act would be the day of the engagement party of little Edie, that something bad would happen and the engagement would break up and she would try to leave home. Then we would come back to the house 35 years later when everything had gone to seed. And once again, they'd be living in this Beckett-like atmosphere of timelessness, rehashing the past. She would again try to leave and not succeed. And so somebody heard that we were doing this, and we got a call from Sundance Festival, which was run by Philip Himberg. And he said, would you like to do a workshop of this at the Sundance Festival? And we said, well, we barely have one act written. He said, well, let's work on it. Let's see what we can do. Who would be your dream cast? We said, well, our dream cast would be Michael Greif directing, Christine Ebersole, and he said, let me try. And he called up Christine Ebersole. He says, Christine, I'm so sorry to call you. I know I called you once before and you said you don't do these kind of things, and I'm sorry to bother you. And she said, oh no, I really don't do these kind of things. He said, but well, these guys really wanted me to ask you. It's Grey Gardens. And she said, Grey Gardens? Grey Gardens? Yes, I'll do it. I love that, and I've been wanting to play that role forever. So fortuitously, everything came together. We went to Sundance with a half-written show, and while they were rehearsing Act 1 and waiting for material from Act 2, Michael Greif had time to stage the whole thing in like 4 or 5 days with the cast that we eventually opened with. And I remember we were furiously writing Act 2. We had written a song called Around the World for little Edie to sing when she goes up into the a deserted room in this dilapidated mansion and talks about the things that she saves, shells and old posters and Mardi Gras costumes. pins them up on the wall and imagines she can go around the world. It was based on an image in the documentary where she saw a bird flying off and wished she could be that free. So we thought that was going to be the big song in Act Two. And Scott wrote this music first for that. And it went around the world with, and I said, oh, that sounds like some outtake from Jacques Brel. He said, just write the words. We need it for tomorrow morning. So I wrote words to this melody that I didn't care for. Then I went to the rehearsal the next morning, and at 3 a.m, he had written an entirely new melody to the words that I wrote for his melody that I didn't like. Christine is amazing. She's able to look at something once and sing it. And she sang it for us, and I was blown away. I mean, even remembering it, that's what I work for, those moments in rehearsal and workshop where you can create something with collaborators that's special, that you feel hasn't been done before, that sort of pushes you to your edge. That's what I love about this. I love it much more than production. So we thought that was going to be the big song in Act Two. But then I was taking a shower in my little cabin, and Doug Wright bursts in, and he said, Michael, we need a new 11 o'clock number. I said, well, it's going to be Around the World or Reprise. He said, no, we need something special. Little Edie has to try to leave home and be unable to get out of the front gate of her house. And we need it by tomorrow. So, oh my God. And so I got out of the shower and I dried myself, and I went outside, and I saw this bush, and I saw a leaf blowing in the wind that was attached to the bush by a spider web. And this idea came to me about another winter in a summer town, which was Little Edie's 11 o'clock song. I don't know if everyone knows what an 11 o'clock song is. That's sort of the climactic song of the show, where a character has some kind of epiphany or realization. I wrote this lyric, and Scott said, I'm not ready to set this. I think that we should use Around the World for the 11 o'clock song. And we can't have two songs that are so similar. And so I said, well, let's see what happens. And I gave the lyric to Christine, and she read it in a run-through that we did for the other people there. And she read it like it was a poem. And everyone loved it, and she cried, and the audience cried at this lyric. And everyone ran up to Scott afterwards and said, oh, Scott, this is brilliant. You should leave this as the 11 o'clock poem. And he said, hell no, I'm not having an 11 o'clock poem in my show. And he set it to this gorgeous music, and that's how we had that show, that song. And then we tried it out at Playwrights Horizons, that we thought that was going to be it. But we were very worried at first about how the audience would respond, because it has a coterie of devotees that consider the documentary to be biblical and sacred. And actually, some of them came dressed as the Edies for the first night, and they actually brought rotten fruit with them. They were prepared to pelt us with it. But something about our idea worked for them. The curtain went up on a brief prologue, and then it went back to the 1940s. So they were disarmed. They said, this is not what we expected. And they got drawn in, and then Act Two opened all those years later, and they became its greatest fans, and it became extended 3 or 4 times. And then suddenly it was moving to Broadway, which I had never expected. I thought of myself as an opera librettist at this time, that I would never write a commercial show for Broadway. And suddenly this small, strange, uncommercial show was on Broadway. And it was a wonderful experience. I would an author has to stay in touch with the cast. They don't like it when you don't show up for the performances. So I would go to the show almost every performance. I wouldn't always stay for the whole thing, but I was there for the last 15, 20 minutes of it every single night. And then you go back and chat with the cast. I don't know if other authors are that way, but I think they are. When you write a show, you can't just write it and go away. You have to remain a part of it, at least until the cast changes. But we worked so closely with all of those actors, those wonderful actors. John McMartin, I wrote songs just for him. He had been in a concert that I had done at Carnegie Hall with the Gay Men's Chorus. And he was thinking of retiring. He didn't want, but his wife, who ran the Irish Rep, and I conspired to coax him back into musical theater with the role of Edie's grandfather. It was just wonderful working with these people every night. And then that led to other strange shows with Scott Frankel.
There were actually other productions of Grey Gardens after.
Has been done quite a bit. It didn't run that long on Broadway, but it must have 50 to 100 productions in this country, around the country. It's been done all over the world, in Japan, where it was a big hit, in Poland, in Australia, in England. It just goes everywhere. And
did you see any of those productions?
I did. We were brought to Japan to see that one and talk to audiences, and they responded to it very differently. First of all, they translated it into Japanese, and the Japanese culture is very respectful of its parents. Children are supposed to respect their parents and tend to them in old age. And so, though in our culture it was something of a freak show, in that culture it was about a daughter who loved and respected her mother and took care of her in old age. That's how they construed it. And it played all over Japan. We went to London for the production that they did, fringe production there. That was a big hit. And I think everyone relates to a mother and daughter story. And you never have to have heard of these people. But the very fact that they had been living in a almost royal situation, and then they had a great fall from grace and had only each other, and had the disdain and contumely of their entire neighborhood, their snotty East Hampton neighborhood. And they became, as they called, strong individualists, and almost defiantly kept their house a wreck and fed 55 cats. They had no money anymore. All the marriages and everything had broken up. The family had deserted them. But they became almost heroic in their individualism. We never looked at them as clownish or freakish. We took their situation seriously. We did not consider it camp, as some people accused it of. If we had wanted to write a camp show, we could have, but we did not write a camp show. We took them very seriously, and we thought of it as a strangely deconstructed story in these two different eras. So it gets done all over the world still. I hope that it will come back to Broadway again, because I would love young people to see it. You know, young people have become so reinvigorated with Broadway. They particularly like shows about themselves, like Mean Girls, or all the shows about young people. But they love musicals, and maybe they're sick and tired of the internet. I think they love live theater. And I teach musical theater now at Yale and at Columbia. And they know all these musicals. when I was their age, we were listening to Cat Stevens and Joni Mitchell and all of that stuff, and nobody knew musicals. And if they did, they thought they were for their parents. And yeah, I was going home and listening to Pippin and A Little Night Music after school every single day for a year, but the rest of them were not. And today, these young people know all these shows, and they want to write them. And Hamilton has done a miracle for the musical theater. They know every word by heart. They love it, and they're inspired to try and write their own. And there are wonderful, diverse, interesting, rule-bending musicals coming out from all of them. So I would love for them to see a revival of Grey Gardens, because I respond to them almost more than I do to the older audiences. I mean, God bless the older audience, the subscription audiences. They keep all this theater alive. But
what was the age of the people in off-Broadway and Broadway?
Well, that's the thing. When you do a play like we did at Playwrights Horizons or Lincoln Center, or well, we did two. We did Far From Heaven and Grey Gardens at Playwrights Horizons. We did a show with Susan Stroman and John Wyman at Lincoln Center, the downstairs theater, and they have subscription audiences that are wonderful. They come to everything that these theaters do. They're willing to give new work a chance. They come, but they tend to have been subscribing for many years. They have the seats that they like. They come back every year, and they're of a different generation, many of them, and they don't shout and interrupt songs with cheers in the middle. They don't give standing ovations. They're a more reserved generation. So you don't know if they're really loving it or not until the subscriptions run out and they start letting general audience in. Then you get a more varied age groups, and then you get all the crazy people interrupting songs in the middle, which is considered rude and unseemly behavior in the theater. But you know what? It makes it exciting for everyone around them. That is the wonderful thing about live theater. And God, I hope it comes back soon, because that audience becomes bonded and they respond to each other as well as to what's going on the stage. So, Bruce, from all the shows that you've sat through, where after about 10 minutes, people start coughing, and then they cough here and they cough there and they cough, and then the whole thing falls apart. But if there's no coughing and they're just listening to every word, they could come in with the cold and the sniffles, but if they like it, they stop coughing. And they listen, and then they all laugh at the same spot, and they all cry at the same spot. That's how you know your show is working. Some writer, I think it was John Guare, said to me, who I love and admire so much, you have to watch out for the big laughs and the little laughs. When I hear the little laughs, which means 5 people over this corner are laughing or up in the balcony are laughing, but not the other people, then I cut those. I cut the little laughs. I only want the big laughs where everyone laughs, because if some people don't get it, then the other people say, hey, what am I not getting? And they stop liking and they sort of step out of the show. So that's what previews are for. It's for listening to the audience and watching how the show works and refining it in front of a live audience. And, it works for everything. It works for opera. Opera and musicals are not so different. Audience are the best arbiter of what's working.
Tell us about Happiness.
Oh, Happiness. Well, that was based on a concept by Susan Stroman, who noticed how people work themselves like slaves in New York for some kind of goals and ambitions. And they never stop to think about, are they finding personal happiness out of this in their lives? And we wanted to do a series of stories based on people like we knew. It didn't really work as a musical. We had thought that chorus line would be a precedent, where you're telling a lot of stories at once. But in our story, what happened is that these people find themselves on a metaphysical subway where they're between life and death. And they have to find a moment in their lives that made them happy. And then they go out of the show. Well, then it became very episodic. And the audience was able to predict, oh, so they're the next ones to go. When are they all going to go? I'm already watching my watch. And I realized that you can tell a lot of stories, but what Chorus Line did was that they kept everybody on stage, and you never knew who was picked for the chorus line until the last 10 minutes of the show. And so the suspense kept going. It's one of those things that you learn. I always was intrigued by the idea of doing a show that would be like a collection of short stories. But the theater is not short stories. The theater has to have a continuous thrust, and I look at it like an accrual of energy. When I was a kid back in Teaneck, I used to accompany the summer and the school musicals, and South Pacific was one of the musicals that I had to accompany. And I noticed from playing it every day that the way the first act worked was it had this wonderful twin soliloquies for Nellie Forbush and Emile DeBeck. Then it had a number with only men, the Sailors. And then it had a number with only women. I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair. And then it had a glorious love ballad. And Some Enchanted Evening. And I noticed the amount of dialogue and the kinds of songs that happened, and how after one song excited them, the audience was able to carry their excitement from that till the next one, until they got to a place where they were so excited that they were transported into this world. And I call that musical geography. It's kind of the songs go like this, and it keeps going up the hill, accruing energy until you get to an act break, if you've earned an act break. And it taught me so much about musicals have to be told through the music. It's not a question of taking a story and sticking songs in it. And those feelings were reaffirmed by working in previews and workshops in front of audiences, or the Lehman Engel workshop, where I learned that a song in a musical has to advance the story. You can't just sing a song and end up where you were in the story. It has to have moves forward, even if it's just from A to C or A to E. It won't go from A to Z, but it has to move forward a little bit. Otherwise, the audience can just check its watch, which is the problem I have with some of the big mega musicals that were such hits, like Les Mis or Phantom. They work for all audiences, but I find that the songs, to me, pick a topic, stay on it, and don't advance. And when the song is over, you're where you were, and then you pick up the story in the book. Audiences, I guess some audiences like that, particularly if it's an audience with people who speak a lot of different languages, like we get in New York City. they're able to follow it, but it's not exciting like a play is. And I think a musical should be like a play or an opera. An opera tells the play through music. I'm actually on an interesting musical right now, which, knock on wood, will be coming back this fall at Lincoln Center. It's called Flying Over Sunset. And the book and the direction is by the great James Lapine. And the music is by Tom Kitt, who wrote Next to Normal. It's our first collaboration working together. And James had a concept about doing a musical set in the 1950s with 4 people who were experimenting with LSD. And he came to me with this idea for a show. Said, do you want to do this show about drugs? I said, oh, no, I don't take drugs. I don't like drugs. People sitting around a pool taking drugs? I don't think so. And he said, just read it. And he had written a rough book, part of Act 1. And it was really interesting. I had no idea that people like Aldous Huxley, the great British author of Brave New World, an essayist, or Claire Booth Luce, who wrote The Women and then later married Henry Luce of Time magazine, or Cary Grant, the movie star, had experimented with LSD back in the late 1950s. So with my philosophy, if it's a crazy idea, it must be good. I said, this is really interesting. This is not people sitting around a pool. And we started working with Tom and writing these songs. And we've been developing it through workshops. Since it's completely original, there was no play to base it upon. And it was based upon fact through a playwright's filter. It's been finding its shape through workshops. And it's taken quite some years, 4 or 5 years, because James hears something, sees something, and then he wants to change it. So out goes that song, in comes a new one. And then I started out in this collaboration a little bit hidebound. I said, James said, what if we only have them sing when they're high on LSD? I said, what? And then you're going to have 20 minutes of talking and then you're going to have a song? No, they have to sing through the whole thing. So, well, we'll try it, but I think my idea is better. And finally, it wasn't working. And James said, why don't we try it my way? And I said, okay. And to my surprise, the show found its shape when they only sang when the LSD kicked in. And I realized there was a precedent for it. It was, of all things, Lady in the Dark, which had been written so many years ago by, you know who wrote that, Moss Hart. And
Kurt Weill and Ira Gershwin.
Ira Gershwin, right. And they found an interesting format where the musical sequences were almost like opera. They were long, extended musical sequences, and then there would be long periods of play, and then there would be another dream sequence that was musicalized. And I said, there is a precedent for this, but what we have to do is not write songs per se. We have to actually, particularly in Broadway musicals and musicals, they have a song ends with what is called a button. And that's where you modulate to a higher key and sing very loud. And the lighting director, the lighting designer bumps up the lights and the orchestra plays a very loud final chord. And you kind of freeze for a moment and the audience bursts into applause. And so when the audience bursts into applause, they know they liked something. But it's kind of manipulative, these buttons, that everyone works so hard to get so that they'll get applause. I said, what if we take out all the buttons do not encourage them to burst into applause, and make these scenes fluid and musical. And that's what we did. And then Lincoln Center Theater became interested. We did a workshop there, and with the cast that we basically now have.
Tell us who's in the cast.
It was very moving. Tony Yazbek as Cary Grant. I can't remember all their names because I'm terrible with names. The fellow who played Henry Higgins, then My Fair Lady is Aldous Huxley. Carmen, what is her last name? Carmen is Claire Booth Luce. I'll find the names. And it was very moving. The strange thing is that most of it is based on fact. What is not factual is that these people knew each other. That is where James Lapine makes a dramatic leap. So what it is we meet these people, find out about their lives and their need to experiment with this drug because of issues that they're having in their life. At that time, it was not looked at as a recreational drug. It was looked at as a part of self-exploration that was could be administered by a psychiatrist or a psychologist when you're in therapy. It was looked on as a tool, and it was legal in the 1950s. Psychiatrists were able to prescribe it as a part of therapy. So these individuals are experimenting to deal with the crises or conflicts or problems in their lives. Then they find out one way or another that these other people are taking it, and they decide what they're going to do is to try and take a group trip and see what happens. That's Act 2. So Act 1 is we meet them individually, then they meet each other, and then Act 2 is their group trip. This was a very unusual form, but I love unusual forms. You know, like Grey Gardens, or sometimes where it works, or Happiness where it did not work. But I love experimenting with forms. And so we had a gorgeous production that was in the works and set to open in the Vivian Beaumont Theater. And then out came the pandemic, and the governor closed the theater. I think it was March 14th. That was our first preview. And so we had to shut down on our very first preview. What would have been our first preview for the public. Luckily, you know, what happens when you do a show is that you do get the show to a beautiful state, and then you go into technical rehearsals where you add the lights, the costumes, and you put it on the stage. And then it starts looking terrible for about 3 weeks, and everyone forgets everything. But then, and it takes that whole period to get through tech. And then finally you have your first preview, and then you sit there biting your nails to see if the show is going to come together and people are going to remember what it's about. And if you're lucky, it works. And so there was that preview that we were supposed to have in front of an audience that was suddenly canceled. But the theater decided to do it anyway so that we could tape it archivally. Mm-hmm. That if we ever came back, we'd remember what we did. So that's what we did. And there was an invited audience that was very socially distanced and spaced apart, just maybe 50 people in that gigantic theater. But it worked. It was beautiful. And that was only the first preview. And I said, my God, what we could do in a period of 2 weeks or 3 weeks of previews, really fine tune this thing. It's already so beautiful. But we had to shut down. We had no idea if we're coming back or not. Until 2 days ago, I got an email from Lincoln Center that we're optimistically looking forward to reopening the theater in the fall and going back into rehearsals in October, things permitting, you know, if the vaccines work. And so optimistically, we're looking at returning in the fall, and knock on wood, we will. But I was just so moved and gratified that the theater believed in this show enough to come back to it. I hope whenever we do reopen that we will be able to reach an audience, that the audiences will not be afraid to come back into the theater, and that the show will reach them. You know, I feel like the world has changed in this year, and there were bigger things to worry about than musical theater. We've lost millions of people in the world. We've had corrupt and incompetent administration that allowed this virus to spread much worse than it could have been. And these are the priorities, and getting people losing their jobs, and people not being able to send their kids to school. These are all such big problems, so much bigger than musical theater. And so it occurred to me that when and if we all return to the theater, will the things that we were writing still speak to people? But I just have a feeling that this particular show will. One thing is that it's set in the 1950s, which gives it a kind of timelessness. It's not set a year ago. It's set in a different time, and it's looking forward to a future, the 60s that were coming. And I've been busy during the pandemic. At first, I lost 5 or 6 productions and had no income. That was canceled. 3 or 4 operas were canceled. Productions abroad were canceled. Suddenly, nothing was happening. You work years to get these things in place so that you can keep working on the next thing. But it all fell apart. But my collaborators and I got together and came up with new ideas for shows. So I've been working on a new one with Scott Frankel and Jonathan Tollins, the playwright who wrote Buyer and Seller. And we just did a socially distanced workshop for 4 days with Audra McDonald. And that's looking very promising. We have 1 act done. I'm working on another show and another opera, a new one with Ricky Ian Gordon, with whom I wrote The Garden of the Finzi Continis, based on the book and film. That's going to be produced when theater comes back by the New York City Opera in conjunction with the Yiddish theater that did the Fiddler on the Roof production. And that's supposed to happen in January of 2022. So we've been working on that, and we're going to do a socially distanced workshop of that. I have a new piece with Stuart Wallace, who I wrote Where's Dick and Harvey Milk with, and Mark Campbell. I've written a co-libretto called Supermax, which is about some of the things we're dealing with today. American terrorism, and a couple of other pieces, something in the works with Adam Gettle and Teresa Rebeck. And so, I'm knock on wood, theater will come back, and I'll keep doing this until no one's interested.
For Sunset, is there more than the 4 people in the cast? Is there a supporting?
Yes, there are people who appear, other people in their lives. There are people from their pasts who appear in visions. There are children, there are psychiatrists. Yes, it's not a huge cast, but it's like 10 people and 1 child. But it's a beautiful, dreamlike show. It's very unusual.
Tell us about Far From Heaven.
Well, Far From Heaven Richard Greenberg, the wonderful playwright, came to see the very final performance of Grey Gardens, and contacted Scott Frankel, the composer, and I about doing a musical. And we came to a meeting with him with a bunch of ideas. He says, no, I don't want to do any of your ideas. I want to do a musical of the film Far From Heaven, which is also set in the 1950s in suburbia about the awakening of a woman who had led one kind of life, and suddenly it's thrown all out of kilter. And she has to re-find herself, and she finds that the heavenly suburban life that she thought she was living is quite far from heaven. And we thought, based on the film, that it would make a wonderful musical piece for Kelly O'Hara. And for whatever reason, Scott and I like to write for performers. You know, we did it for Christine, we did it for Kelly. We're doing it for Audra if that works out. It's a wonderful challenge to write for an actress or an actor and collaborate with them. You know, I'm so respectful of people who have to go out there and do this every single night in front of live audiences. And I feel that they understand the character at a certain point much better than I do. And if they have an idea, well, this character would never say that, or this character would never think that, I listen to it. I used to be very much, well, let's just try what we wrote and see how that works. I'm not that way anymore. These days, if somebody has an idea and they really don't like what we're doing, why should they have to do it every night? Let's just try something else. There's a million ways of doing it. And so I say, fine, I'll come up with something else. So I do like working for actors, and I do like doing that with opera too. You know, people have an idea about opera, that it's more academic and intellectual than musical theater, but really it's made in the exact same way. You go into a workshop or a rehearsal and you start changing things, and you do what works, and then you adjust it in front of an audience. So Far From Heaven, Richard Greenberg thought we should really try and emulate the shape of this screenplay almost exactly, because it's perfect as it is. And that was the supposition, but then of course we changed it. And that is a very
based on the audience.
It was very hard to tell with that audience, because as I said, that was the subscription audience, and they were quiet. And then as the run changed, they became less quiet and more vocal.
You have talkbacks at all?
Yes, we had talkbacks. That was helpful. And we did change it. We wrote a more optimistic ending than we had originally intended to do. We changed the whole second half of the second act. We cut out we cut things, we rewrote. Yeah, we did quite a lot of changing based on audience response during previews. And it's still a very dark show. So it's not, though Grey Gardens is dark, somehow it's more buoyant than Far From Heaven, which doesn't get done that often, but I have seen a few other productions of it, and it's very good. Unfortunately, there was supposed to be a production this year in London that was canceled because of the pandemic. I hope that it will come back once we all get vaccinated and lick this thing. But I was looking forward to having another shot at that.
Was it difficult to get the rights to the Grapes of Wrath?
Yes, that was a strange story. Ricky Gordon and I don't know if you remember from an hour ago when we started talking ago, I talked about how I met Scott Frankel in a show that was done in Philadelphia where they put together a lot of new writers. Well, Ricky Gordon was one of those writers in that show too, and that's where we met. And then we found out that we live a block apart. And we kept meeting at the corner bodega, buying milk, and saying, one day we should write a show together. And years went by. And one day he met me in the bodega buying milk. And he said, something came up. What would you think of The Grapes of Wrath as an opera? And I said, that's insane. And I usually like insane ideas, but an opera, takes much longer to do than a musical. The music is more attenuated. How am I going to do a 600-page novel and do it justice in one evening? He said, just read the book and tell me what you think. So I had read it a long time ago in high school, probably as quickly as I could. So I reread it again, and I read this in one very long sitting. I was just mesmerized. And I realized that Steinbeck had written it in 3 acts. There's the story of the Joad family being dispossessed from their land in Oklahoma and having to migrate to California based on some false promises in flyers that promised work in California. So there's the story of being dispossessed. Then there's the great challenge of crossing the Mojave Desert. Then there's the promised land, California, and does it live up to its promise? And these 3 acts, the way the story is divided, being dispossessed, the exodus, and the promised land, it occurred to me, you could do an epic opera in 3 acts, the old-fashioned way with 2 intermissions, like all the Verdi operas had been written. And we met with the opera company that wanted to do it. And the story with the rights was that for many, many years, many people had wanted to option the rights to do it as an opera. It had been done as a play. It had been done as a film. It had never been done as an opera. And a lot of great, great opera composers wanted to do it. And the Steinbeck estate would never give the rights to do it as an opera because they felt that the music that these great composers was writing was too great. It didn't sound American. It didn't sound like The Grapes of Wrath. And then the Minnesota Opera wanted to do this, and they wanted Ricky to do it. And he has a very American sound. He writes operas that merge song forms and then blend seamlessly into recitative. He's a wonderful composer. It's closer, I would say, to a Porgy and Bess style of writing an opera than, say, Wozzeck, which is through composed and atonal. Ricky is tonal, though still very operatic. Anyway, they played Ricky's music for the Steinbeck estate, and miraculously, they said, yes, this is the composer that should do it. With opera, it's usual that the composer gets okayed first. So he got okayed, then they came to me. I met him in the bodega. I reread the book. I said, yes, this will work. And then we met with the opera company, and they said, we know it's very long. What if you did this as a 2-night event, show, like Nicholas Nickleby? And I said, I don't think that'll work because that means that where you leave off in the first half of the story is in the middle of the Mojave Desert. Who's going to want to come back to see Act 2? I said, what if we went back to the old form of opera, the classic form, and did a longish opera, but had 2 intermissions? And followed the structure that I perceive that is very musical in the book, Also, what's interesting is that in every other adaptation, they kind of use the chapters of the book that furthers the story of this dispossessed family, the Joad family, and the Ma Joad, and Tom Joad, the brother the oldest son who gets out of prison and travels with the family, breaks his parole, and goes to California. But besides these stories, there were chapters in between these story chapters where Steinbeck wrote almost essays from a journalistic or different points of view of characters that never appeared in the main story. And he would talk about agribusiness, and he would write about the sort of invisible enemy of capitalism, the pass the buck of it's not my fault that you're getting dispossessed, blame the bank. The bank says it's not my fault, blame the government. And I said, you know what, these journalistic political chapters we can do in an opera, because in an opera we have a chorus that you didn't have in a play and you didn't have in a movie. We can really use the operatic chorus to do these chapters. So that was part of the concept, was to do a more complete version of the Grapes of Wrath that had ever been done. And they said, well, if you can do it in 3 hours, then go for it. But longer than 3 hours, we have to pay the orchestra overtime double. And in opera, you have, this was going to be a big orchestra. It was going to be like 60 people on stage, 50 people in the orchestra, extras, sets, costumes for days. But I said, you know what? Yeah, we can do it in 3 hours. I said to myself, look, if the first act is an hour and 5, the second act is 55, and the third act is an hour, I'll come in at 3 hours. And we ran off and wrote an hour that took 4 hours. And we said, well, we'll cut it. And then we had a big problem, because they said, 4 hours? What about the intermissions? That's an additional 40 minutes. I said, what you never said anything about intermissions. I had to include 40 minutes in the 3 hours. They said, yes. I said, that gives me no time at all. Now we have an event that will take 4 hours and 40 minutes, and you want to fit it into 3 hours. And we had a disaster. And so we started cutting, but we couldn't cut it that much because it's a big story. We were able to cut it down from 4 hours to about 3 hours and 10 minutes, which is a lot when you think of how much happens in a minute on stage. So we cut, 50 minutes out of this opera. And there were wonderful sequences where floods were happening, and earthquakes, and all kinds of geographical events, and long sequences that Steinbeck wrote about. A lot of them just had to go, which was sad. But even with 3 hours and 10 minutes, we still had 20 minutes of intermission. And they said, well, cut an intermission. I said, absolutely not. This is where I get very difficult. When it comes to structural things, I had written the opera so that each act would end with something cataclysmic, so that there would be a note of suspense to come back on. And I don't like just cutting intermissions. An audience needs to breathe and think about what they just saw. They just did this wonderful revival of Porgy at Bess at the Met, and they moved the intermissions around. I didn't like that. I liked where the Gershwins and Dubose Hayward had put their intermissions themselves. And you can't just make something 2 acts because you want it to be. It doesn't work the same. Something climaxes in the music, then you want to get up and talk about it. But no, it keeps going on for another 45 minutes. That just doesn't work to me. So I said, no, we cannot cut an intermission. So they had to call in all kinds of people, have all kinds of conferences, and finally they had to raise a whole bunch of extra money so that they could pay the overtime for these long, for the length of this opera and the 40 minutes of intermissions, which they wouldn't cut. I said, why don't you do 30 minutes of intermissions? No, our audience needs 40. Luckily, it was a hit. So, but that was very scary. The other thing about opera is that was a gigantic opera, and it had never been tried out in front of an audience, unlike theater, where you get several weeks of previews where you can fine tune it. On opera, you don't. You may have a workshop. You may have developmental things where you can try it out in front of an audience, but you don't really see the whole big production in the 2,000-seat opera house until the first night. And that's usually the night when they invite all the critics so that they can sell tickets for the rest of the run. And so it's like opening your show on the first night of previews. So it's really scary. And the technical rehearsals for that were like scenes from The Bandwagon, where sets are flying, everything's going wrong, the costumes are wrong, the lighting is terrible, you can't see anything, you can't hear anything. 200 people are running around, there are 100 people in the orchestra, you know, hundreds of technical people. Ricky and I looked at each other and said, oh my God, what chaos have we wrought? But the miraculous thing about opera companies is that they're usually able to pull it together by the first performance. And if you've constructed it correctly and the opera company runs itself correctly, it works. I said to one of the lighting designers who had lit one of my musicals, was also lighting one of my operas. And I said, why is it that in a musical you can have 4 weeks to light it, and in an opera you have 3 days to light it, and they both look great? He said, you know what, that's just the way it works. You work it, you make it work in the time you have, and now I can't talk to you anymore because I don't have a minute to spare. And for some reason, that's just the way it works in opera. And it worked. And then that opera has been done quite a bit. And it was done also in concert versions in Carnegie Hall and Disney Hall. And then it came back in a new production a couple of years ago. And that's going around. What I would love to see is for that to happen in Europe, but that hasn't happened yet.
Because an agent? Can an agent help you there?
No, they're working on it. They're working on it. It has to do with politics and the way that countries feel about America these days. You know, they don't necessarily want to do a very American story anymore. They're mad at us. I hope that they will overcome that, because I think Grapes of Wrath is a universal story. Every culture has this kind of upheaval. You know, one of the things that I was proudest of is that when we premiered it, you know, from my days at the Village Voice and all of that, I'm a leftist, and I've always tried to get a little bit of politics and journalism into my work. I've always loved doing that. That's why I gravitate towards things that are based on fact or have journalistic elements. And in the Grapes of Wrath, Ricky and I were able to touch on issues about our current situation with the border and immigrants from Mexico trying to come here to get work. We didn't update it, but we found sections where, for example, where there's migrant workers in a field, and I gave them a song in Spanish, a morning prayer. And they were all women, and they were clearly Mexican immigrants. And I just had that happening in the background, and other things like that, because I think that what's great is when you write a piece set in a period, so like Hamilton, and you think you're going in to see some kind of historical piece, and suddenly you realize, oh my, this is not history. This is the world today, reflected through the eyes of a different time. And I think it's important for an audience to respond to a work that has meaning to their own lives. But I don't like to underline it or try and update it. I like them to come to that realization themselves and say, I thought I was coming in to watch something about the Depression era in America, and I realize I'm looking at a problem that is constant in America. This hostility we have towards immigrants, this constant push-pull between capitalism and progressivism, socialism. And Steinbeck was, a big socialist. And it's funny that opera companies wanted to do that, because opera companies are all funded by stalwart Republicans and oil companies and things like that. I have to go to board dinners with them beforehand. And sometimes it gets pretty udgy. Sitting with these people, and they say, I gave money to this opera, but I think it's a big socialist opera and I don't believe in it at all. But I believe in supporting the opera. And I say, well, I'll see you opening night and tell me what you think. It's really too much. But the first night of this opera, it worked for this audience, and a man came up to me, one of these stalwart Republicans, with tears in his eyes. He said, oh my God, I realize now that these Mexican immigrants who are coming here and crossing our border are just like the Jode family. They're just trying to find work for their family, to stay alive and to support their children. And I said, hallelujah. That's why I'm doing this.
Does the recording of Grapes of Wrath have everything on it?
There's a recording of the complete version that's probably available on Amazon, where everyone buys everything these days. It's a big 3 CD set. And I think you can probably also get it as a download. But I liked people to buy CDs, so then they get the booklet and they can read all the lyrics. It
like
is
a 64-page booklet. How many? Like
all
a producer over.
Wait, I'll turn around, I'll show it to you. Here it is. It's very, very large. You can see. And that's the full version. When we brought back the opera 2 years ago in Detroit and in St. Louis, they really could not afford to do 3 hours and 40 minutes. They said, things have changed since you premiered this, 12 years ago. Is there a way of doing a 2-act version? And I talked about my feeling about doing 3 acts with 1 intermission. I said, no way. I said, if you want to do a 2-act version, then I have to rewrite the whole opera so that it will work with 1 intermission. And actually what we had done in some of these concert versions at Carnegie Hall, we had this concert version at Carnegie Hall, which was done by opera stars and Broadway stars, like Vicki Clark and Christine Ebersole, and it was narrated by Jane Fonda, who always loved Grapes of Wrath because that was her father's movie. Henry Fonda. And in doing that version, I did find a place where there could be one intermission and not two, because we took out so much and we narrated the scenes in between. So I found one break. I said, well, if I rewrite the opera in 2 acts, I'll use that act break. And that would come in what was the middle of Act 2. Now would be the end of Act 1, and I have to make a lot of changes to make that work. And we did. We wrote a new version of it. So that happens in 3 hours with one intermission. And it's very good. But what we lost were some of the more experimental things that we tried in the longer version, like the chapters that I talked about with Steinbeck and the politics. We had to mostly focus on the story. And I had to rewrite, Ricky and I had to rewrite and reorchestrate the whole thing. But it makes it more affordable. You know, there was a certain point where new opera was really growing. All those wonderful Philip Glass operas and John Adams operas like Nixon in China. There was a whole Harvey Milk, Grapes of Wrath. These were exciting audiences in new operas. Usually they looked at new operas as like taking medicine. It was going to be some atonal, 12-tonal thing with no melody about something boring and intellectual or biblical. But that all changed with Philip Glass and Robert Wilson and Nixon in China, and a whole new way of looking at opera. And writing about operas that were even documentary-like. Nixon in China, Einstein on the Beach, the Klinghoffer opera, you know, and they even coined a term for it. They called it CNN opera. I didn't mind. It fit with my philosophy that people should be able to see their lives in an opera. It should be about them in one way or another. But things went along for a while, and then we had the terrible financial troubles in this country. And a lot of opera companies lost a lot of money and lost their endowments. You know, there was the whole Bernie Madoff thing, where certain companies lost their endowments. And the audience changed. They didn't have those wonderful blue-haired ladies giving money and supporting. And they had to tighten their belts. And so that's what we did with the Grapes of Wrath. And now people can do the big version or the 2-act version. And the Garden of the Finzi Cantinis, we started big. And responding to the times, we brought it down. And I think it's just as strong. I'm very excited to see that opera. It was, I don't know if you remember the film by De Sica. That's about an aristocratic Italian Jewish family in the Mussolini World War II era that kind of considers themselves above the fray and unaffected by events outside their garden wall. By their garden, they mean this gorgeous estate. And of course, they are not above what's happening around them, and it's a Holocaust story. Of course, the Jews are all deported from Italy to concentration camps. And that's what is alluded to at the end. And the idea of building walls and trying to wall yourself off from reality seemed like what we were doing in America. to me. So once again, without sort of underlining it, I gravitated towards this story because it spoke to concerns that we have today. I was actually so glad to hear that people could saw through Donald Trump's wall with a saw that they bought at Home Depot. That idea of the wall was so obnoxious to me. But I felt that it wasn't just a wall to Mexico. We were walling ourselves in from reality, from the global situation, from finding real solutions to things. And we had a silly fantasy solution propounded by a silly fantasy reality TV president. So I responded to that story in a different time and place.
Is there a recording of that?
No, that's going to open. It's going to be brand new in January of 2022. And
Is there an endowment to record operas?
You know, we haven't even thought about that yet. You're right, we should, because operas don't get done that often. They get done 5 performances here, 6 performances there, and if you want to have a life for it, you need to have a recording. You know, it's just such a surprise that we were able to even get a production plan during this pandemic that you're right, we have to start thinking about getting that recorded. Or maybe getting it, you know, taped for PBS or something like that. Yeah, but we're going to see how it works in January, and we're doing our first workshop, a socially distanced workshop, supposedly this May. I don't know how that's going to work. I guess we'll all wear masks and keep the windows open and put the ventilators on and sit far apart. And because not everybody is going to be vaccinated by May.
Will there be any Broadway people likely involved in this, or opera?
I don't know who the cast is yet. I think that it's going to be all opera people. And that's how Ricky wrote it. He wrote it for operatic voices. And you know, it's just some people can do both, but opera voices they're produced in a different way. Opera singers go through a great amount of training to learn how to sing differently, to learn how to breathe differently and create this larger than life sound. Broadway singers can sing 8 or 9 performances a week, and because they get mic'd, they get amplified. They don't have to use this. And still, even then, it's a strain on your voice to do that many performances, but they can do it. They can do a matinee and an evening performance if they reserve their forces carefully. Opera singers can't do that. They have to take days off between singing. And so it's a different way of composing. So you can't, and it doesn't mix well when you mix together theater performers who need amplification and opera singers who don't want it. So you have to write it for one or the other. You know, there's a lot of talk about what makes an opera or what makes a musical. The best explanation that I ever heard was from John Corigliano, the wonderful composer who wrote The Ghost of Versailles. And he said, don't look at it as a qualitative difference. Look at it as a technical difference. If you need dancers to perform it, like West Side Story, then it's a musical. If it has to be performed by opera singers, then it's an opera. But don't worry about whether it's songs or whether it's through composer. Just look at the forces that it takes to do it and let that be the definition. I've always liked that. That leaves the most creative options to composers and writers. They don't have to be defined. You know, and let other people worry about whether Porgy and Bess is a musical or an opera. If they say it's an opera, it's an opera. And if it takes opera singers to do it, it's an opera.
The last major musical we haven't talked about is Dr. Zhivago.
Oh, Dr. Zhivago. Well, that was another one of those ideas that I thought was so crazy that I better think about it and consider seriously doing it. Let's do the Russian Revolution in one night on stage. And Lucy Simon is a composer who I like very much. I love her music. She's a wonderful melodist and composer. And the playwright was Michael Weller, who is a great playwright who I admire very much, and it was going to be directed by Des McAnuff. I just like the idea of doing this crazy project, gargantuan project, an epic project. And I felt there was something timely about looking at Dr. Zhivago again, politically. Once we started, what happened was that I was working on Grey Gardens and The Grapes of Wrath at the exact same time. And I couldn't divide myself. It was making me crazy. So the wonderful lyricist Amy Powers came on and we co-wrote lyrics. That worked out great. I loved working with Amy and with Lucy. And we all loved Dr. Zhivago. We tried it out in a black box theater in La Jolla, where it was very immediate and it was poor theater. That was the style, you know, where you saw everything created right in front of you. We didn't have moving trains. We had a platform built of wood, whatever. We had a bench, and the audience had to imagine the Russian Revolution, and everyone was very close to the actors, and it worked great. And then we moved it into the very, very big theater at La Jolla in a whole big production. It didn't work so great in California. So we rewrote it, we rewrote it, and finally we opened it in Australia in a very, very big theater. And it worked. It was very, very good. We rewrote it some more. Maybe we didn't make the best revisions when we suddenly had an opportunity to do it on Broadway. The musical King Kong was supposed to go into the Broadway theater, but it was delayed and delayed and delayed. And suddenly there was an opening. And they said, do you want to do Dr. Zhivago on Broadway? And we all said, oops. We had all thought that the perfect place to open this would be London. We didn't think that New York would be the right place to open Dr. Zhivago because Americans don't like history. We didn't know if they would respond to it. Nonetheless, we did it, and it was a huge fiasco. But in the intervening years, it has been adopted by Europe. And it's had numerous productions in Europe, all over Europe, and it's had 2 more recordings. And I think that what happened was that all of those European countries that are so close to the former Soviet Union, some of them who were occupied by the Soviet Union and were part of the satellites of the Soviet Union, know exactly what it was. Know the history, know the Russian Revolution, know what it was like to have civil wars in their country. And they love it, and it keeps getting done. So I think our original instinct was right, that it needed to be done on the European continent. And that's where it's found a life. You know, if it never comes back to America, I'm fine with that.
Have you seen the European productions?
I have. And there are some amazing pictures. Actually, if you go to my website, michaelkorie.com, you can see, look up Dr. Zhivago. It has pictures from some of these and videos, clips from productions all over the world. They're amazing. And as I said, a new record just came out from Germany in German. There was a record that came out in Poland. And you never hear a peep about any of that over here. Over here, it's you're a flop on Broadway, forget you for the rest of your life. But it's not so. I think that musical of all the musicals is going to outlive all of us.
That's what Amy thinks too, that
Yep,
there's something important there. It's just a matter of people finding it.
It's people finding it, and certainly Europe found it, and Australia found it, and they did it in Korea, and they've done it twice. And it's a great human story. And it's an epic story, and it's got sweep, and Lucy's music is epic. You know, people complained, when it opened here, that it's a throwback to Les Mis. They're trying to recreate the 1980s. You know, nothing like that ever crossed our minds. We were just writing the kind of music that went with that story. And I don't know why people were so snotty about it over here, but I'm very glad it found a life.
Were there any critics here who did stand up for it?
Yeah, of all places, the New Yorker. The New Yorker magazine likes it. The rest of them, I finally had to adopt. You know, you always hear people say, oh, I never read the critics. Well, I used to read the critics. When the newspapers used to come out in print, I would wake up at 5 in the morning to go rush out and find the review. But now I don't read the critics. I get a sense of it from what people tell me, or from looking at the headlines, or from just glancing. But I don't want to know. I want to be told by the audience. And whatever the critics say, that's fine. You know, I think that critics are very similar to those of us who write these shows. They have an audience also. They are writing for their audience, and they have their relationship with their audience, and it's very tied into what goes on. But it's not necessarily the final word. The final word is always with the audience. And the audience, you know, I mean, I think of, you know, humanity and art. The art that humanity has created is not very old. You know, none of it is as old as a single pebble on the beach. What is the oldest art we have is a cave painting in France. It's not that old. Who's to say what's going to be here tomorrow and what's not? What posterity is going to look at and what they're not. So I'm not so worried about what the critics say, as long as it finds an audience and has a chance to have a life.
One last thing. I met you a number of years ago at Silas Marner.
Oh, Silas. Well, we keep trying to get that done. It has such a beautiful score. That one is really tough. People just think of Silas Marner as that old classic they made us read in junior high school, and they don't want to produce it. But it's a wonderful story.
Would you say that definitely is musical? It's not a comedy, but it's not an opera.
It's not an opera. Bruce Coughlin, who's known mostly as an orchestrator, wrote a gorgeous score for it. Meredy and Tony Stein conceived the book. She directed it. He wrote the book. I think it's very good. We were working on trying to get it done before the pandemic, but it just, you know what? It's big. You can't do it with 5 people. And once it gets above a certain number of people, then all the questions of commerciality come in. And it's perceived as an uncommercial show. And those kind of family shows are hard to do. Disney has cornered the market on those.
Do you have any parting advice to young people going into theater? Say opera would be worth looking into?
Well, I'm teaching playwrights right now up at Columbia, and I teach lyricists at Yale about writing new musicals. And I also run a program for the Dramatists Guild Foundation, where we find 3 or 4 teams writing musicals, and we give them a whole year of mentorship. The Dramatists Guild and the Dramatists Guild Foundation are wonderful organizations. They don't have to pay anything. They get paid to be a part of this. And they meet with leading professionals, and we sort of pick people who are right on the cusp. You know, like someone like Michael Jackson, who wrote that show, Playwrights Horizon, that won a Pulitzer Prize. He was one of the fellows. And we find people who are right on the cusp of coming out. And I don't try and tell them to write like me. That's the worst thing, when you say write like I write, or that you have to have rules, or that you have to have perfect rhymes. I just try and say what I learned through experience, which is that let the story be told through the music, whatever that music is. As you can see from Hamilton or from crossover works and music theater, dance theater, all kinds of music work, but the emotional and key plot points have to happen in the music. The songs are not just a divertisement or an aside. They have to be ingrained. And then you could write any style, any story you want. And I encourage them to look at original stories or stories pulled from the headlines or adaptations. And I think that the live theater is having a renaissance for musicals, and that people are finding new forms. I mean, interesting new shows come from unexpected places, like the Great Comet Show, or Hamilton. He had an idea, and it developed into what it was. I think that it's a renaissance for young people and musicals. And then there are also all these new mediums like Netflix and streaming and all of that. And strangely enough, people have been doing a lot of original work on Zoom during this pandemic. And they've been finding out ways to do workshops and readings on Zoom. And, you know, writers and composers just have to hear their work done out loud, and they have to feel it in a performance situation to know if it works. And Zoom is one of them. Who would have thought it?
Is the Lehman Engel group still continuing?
Yes, it does. Lehman Engel was such a great figure in the theater, to me at least. He had been a composer in his youth, written avant-garde music for people like Agnes DeMille and Martha Graham. But then he became a great conductor. And I always appreciated hearing feedback and input from someone that was not another composer or writer. They were in the field, but they would never say, write it like I write it. It's a very difficult thing for writers to tell other writers, write the way you want and don't write the way I write. I don't like it, hearing from a bunch of writers what they think I should do. I like hearing from other people in the theater. So I try to remember that when I'm mentoring young writers and never tell them how I would do it. But Lehman Engel's workshop continues. It's now called the Lehman Engel BMI Workshop. BMI is broadcast music, and together with ASCAP, they are the licensing organizations for music and song. And they continue to sponsor this workshop. I sometimes go back and am a guest moderator for them. It works the same way that it did when I was there with Alan Menken and Lynn and Steve. They have a year. They have to devote a whole year to doing exercises. And then if those work out well, they are able to go into the advanced class where they can work on whatever they want. And they have each other to play it for. I thought it was a valuable experience for me. But I had the benefit of Lehman Engel sort of taking me under his wing. I was probably a better lyricist than I was a composer. My music was good enough to float my lyrics. But, you know, whenever I play something in the class, all the other composers would raise their hands to criticize my F7th or whatever it was. And Lehman Engel would just turn out to the group and say, well, I thought that was wonderful. Does anyone else have a comment? And all the hands would go down. I love that. You know, unadulterated praise. Nothing better. You know, people ask you to come to their shows and tell you what they think, what you think. That's always a tough one. Do they really want to know what you think, or do they really just want support?
I think 90%. I couldn't believe it. You know, there are terms that could be taken more than one way.
Well, I don't like to do that. I would rather just lie and say, I loved it. I'm not going to say, there you go again. That's, you know, writers can see right through those kind of double-edged comments. But if they really want feedback, I'll give it to them. I'll think about it and I'll write it down. And if they really don't, they just want support, I'll just say, great.
I interviewed and spent some time with Sheldon Harnick. And when he came to New York, he intended to write music and lyrics, and he wrote a couple of review songs. But then he was introduced to Yip Harburg.
Yes.
And Yip said, you know, there are many good composers. There are not nearly as many lyricists. So
right.
I would advise you.
Sheldon did write some operas, though. He wrote, you know, an opera called Dragons, and I can't remember because I was in a workshop with him. I love Sheldon. But you're right. And as I said, my own music was okay. But what I learned was, everything I've really learned was from composers, because they have different ways of seeing things. And it doesn't necessarily follow the exact speaking pattern. Their music opens it up. And Scott Frankel and Stuart Wallace and Ricky Gordon and all these, Lucy Simon, all these great composers I've been able to work with have allowed me to grow by showing me the potential in the words that I would never have seen.
Thank you very much. This is a very enjoyable time talking about all your things.
This is a fascinating way to do an interview.
I can come and see Sunset at some point.
Let's knock on wood that we'll all be back in the theater by December.
Great. Thank you again.
So long, Bruce.
Bye-bye.